Chapter 1, Images. An image is a literal or concrete detail that is sensory, a word or phrase that calls on the senses of sight, smell, taste, touch, and sound. In poems, these details are made from language and create pictures or sensations. In life, we're inundated with images: the smell of bread, the blue in the sky after the sun sinks below the horizon, the feel of sand in your bathing suit, the first taste of black bottom pie. Some of these images carry great importance and emotion. Some of them exist without our noticing. All images, no matter how ordinary or unusual, can be used to great effect in a poem. Because we live by collecting images without even trying to, they become especially important and powerful in poetry. They move us and help to bring us to the moment and the place in which the poet is speaking. Hence, they become a kind of time travel machine that transports us back into our past or into the present of the speaker of the poem. Poems aren't summaries or sermons or scientific equations. They are worlds that we enter and experience for a time. When we use images in our writing, we bring those to whom we speak right next to us. Poet Stanley Kunitz says that the artist in the modern world is probably the only person, with a handful of exceptions, who keeps alive that sense of the sharing of this life with others. The art of poetry appeals to our bodies most directly when it uses images to cause us to see, touch, taste, hear, and smell the world with which the speaker of the poem would like to bring us into contact. Abstract language, such as love, peace, despair, and truth, is of deep interest to the poet. But the actual process of making or reading a poem never starts with these. Instead, poetry starts in the body, in the senses, and therefore in images. As you read the following poems closely, may an image lodge itself deeply also in you. Good morning, class. We're here today to talk about poetry, as you know, and we're going to start where poetry starts, which is with images. Does anybody know how you would define an image, what an image is?
An image is it's a picture. It's a piece of sight.
A sensory detail, any kind of concrete detail that engages your senses. So often we think about sight because that's the one I think that we're most conscious of, but it's also the other senses. So touch, hearing, smell, what am I missing? Taste. Yes, those are all images. And, you know, poetry comes from lived experience. Sometimes we think of poetry as something in a book that's very formal, that you memorize for the poetry contest. But in fact, it's really something that people have been doing even before there were books. Over and over again, people would create responses to their world with language, and that language often begins by describing images. Okay, so images are the basement, so to speak, of the house of poetry. And so I want to start our class by having you introduce yourselves, and I want you to introduce yourselves with an image. And just to give you a little context, of course, every day we are being flooded with images. You came here today and the number of things you saw were innumerable. I mean, we would have a very difficult time making a catalog of that. The smells that you encountered from the time you woke up this morning, again, just a flood of them. But often our experience is sort of contained or held in images, and certain images come to mean something to us, and we kind of hold our memory in them. So today I want you to introduce yourself, tell us your name, and tell us an image that has some significance for you. And again, it can be vastly significant, or it can just be one that, in the sea of images that you've already experienced yesterday or today that suggested itself to you, that kind of stuck out above the others. Often when I talk to a friend Ellen's just come back from Honduras, and I will say, tell me your image experience in Honduras, because I feel like I can get a better experience of that trip just having you describe your images. So this is a really common thing that we do in everyday life that enters into poems because it's human. So I'll give you one to begin with. When I was growing up, and I would come home from school on the school bus, and I would walk from the bus stop, hungry, 3:30, and I was hungry, and it had been a long day. I came into the house, and the first thing I would often smell was baking bread, because my mom liked to bake bread. And, when I was a kid, I didn't really think about it that much. It was snack time. I was happy to have bread, and so I did. I sat down and buttered it and ate it. Brown bread, we called it. And but as I grew up, I came to think about my mother's love, which she was communicating to me in various ways, by making something with her hands, by anticipating my arrival home, by welcoming me into the house, by giving me something that was nutritious, that would really nourish me. So that's one image of significance to me. Who wants to start? All right, Seth, you're on the end.
All right. I'm Seth Newkirk. One of the images that I remember the most is I lived in Thailand for a year, and I remember one day we needed to go to the market to buy some food for our housekeeper. In Thailand, the markets are usually outside and usually have, fresh fruits and stuff. But to get to this market, we had to go through a fish market. And I remember the smell was so bad that we were walking through the fish market holding our noses. And by we, I mean me and my other 3 and now 4 siblings. So we were walking through this market, holding our noses, and the Thai were laughing at us pleasantly and saying "farang, farang," which means foreigner, basically. And it was just really funny because it perfectly describes the attitude that the Thai had towards us the entire trip, or the entire stay that we were there. So.
And of course, all that time comes back to you as you
with that memory.
Remember the fish. And if you were to smell fish today, you might also be sort of rocketed back to that period, which was how many years ago?
I was 7, so that's about 7 years.
Okay. Thank you. That's really nice. How about you, Grace?
I love sledding. I love the quiet stillness, the snow, and watching the sunset and all those black lines, and how you get soaked and you feel super tired. Like, it's the most soporific experience because you go inside and you're just ready to sleep. But I don't know. I grew up in North Dakota, so it has a lot of significance. And we were homeschooled, but for recess we'd have to go take our baby brother out in the snow and we had to pull him in sleds because there's no hills in North Dakota. But I don't know. I love that image.
So how long ago were you living there?
We moved when I was 5.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So, again, and when it snows now, do you remember North Dakota?
Oh, yeah, but it's not nearly the magnitude of, we get about, half an inch, full inches here.
It's just like a suggestion of
Yeah.
North Dakota.
Yeah.
That's great. Noah?
Well, my image, it's hard, but I'd have to pick one from my childhood. My grandparents have a cabin out in the forest, and just the sound of my grandfather's voice as he would read to me spent the afternoon drinking tea and reading, and just the sound of his voice as we read in the woods.
Calls all that up. And does being at the cabin or being in the woods recall that period to you or that experience to you?
I guess, though, usually when I'm in the cabin, I'm with a group of people, and so there's a lot of activity going on. But so I think more when I'm just reading with my grandfather, like when we're reading our individual books. So it just remembers.
That's nice. Ellen.
Well, I'm Ellen Davis. I think I'd say sunlight is an image for me because, I like to think I'm a cheery person, so sunlight is kind of like the image of cheeriness, and I like waking up, not during school, to sunlight, coming through my window, and I wake up to that, and it makes getting out of bed easier. And just spending time outside, despite how much time I spend indoors, I do like the outdoors a lot. So sunlight is just sort of, I don't know, really special to me somehow.
And so an emotion has actually come to be associated with a physical experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of gladness and good cheer and even anticipation, happy anticipation in relationship to sunlight.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so you all know what I'm talking about. This is not foreign to you. Let's look at how this works in poems. A couple things that I just would want to say about images. A couple of quotations that people have said, I think, insightfully about images. First, Yeats, who says, "Art bids us to touch and taste and hear and see the world, and shrinks from what Blake calls mathematic form, from every abstract form, from all that is brain only." And what he's saying there is that it's not just poetry that has its basis in experiential knowledge. It's all of art. And experiential knowledge is imagery. Okay, so this is a basis for our experience of art more generally. J. Perrin, who is a poet and fiction writer and teacher from Vermont, says an image is a complex emotional unit involving the whole of the reader's mind. It compels attention by its sound as well as its visual element. It conjoins thought and emotion, making a unified impression. In the very best poems, images lodge deep in the mind where they cannot be easily removed. And I think that as we read and look at poems together, you'll find this. I mean, you've all read poems. In fact, we've done this together before. You've memorized poems. You've written poems. And I think that often you will hear an image and it will make you think of a poem. Or you will remember a poem in terms of its images. One thing that I like to do when I'm memorizing poems with people is organize it according to the images, because our brain just naturally remembers things categorically that way. One other thing that I would just say about imagery, this is a quote from Hans Gadamer, who says that whenever we have to hold something, it is because it is transient and threatens to escape our grasp. In fact, our fundamental experience as being subject to time is that all things escape us, that all the events of our lives fade more and more, so at best they glow with an almost unreal shimmer in the most distant recollection. And part of what he's saying there is that poems, they catch experience for us. They stop time for a minute. It's almost like time is, you've heard this, time is a river, but poetry stops it and gives us the chance to enter it and dwell in it. And that's what imagery does. It allows us to re-enter an experience. So we have the experience again. Okay, so let's move on to some poems. Let's start with The Panther. And I'll read it, and then I'd like another reader to read it after me. Probably you're all pretty familiar with this, but when you study poems, you read them aloud. I don't ever want to hear that you're studying a poem and you haven't heard what it sounds like to the ear, because that's what poetry is. It is an oral art, and it began that way. And reading it more than once is always a benefit. It gives you time to absorb it. You hear things differently. I think you can think of the body as an instrument, and as it's played differently. It's a different instrument according to the person. So hearing a poem more than once is like hearing a song transposed for a different instrument. So it's never a waste of time. This is called The Panther. This is on page 4, and it is written by Rainer Maria Rilke, translated by Edward Snow. The Panther. His gaze has, from the passing of the bars, grown so tired that it holds nothing anymore. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars, no world. The supple pace of powerful, soft strides turning in the very smallest circle is like a dance of strength around a center in which a great will stands numbed. Only sometimes the curtain of the pupils soundlessly slides up, then an image enters, glides through the limbs' taut stillness, dives into the heart, and dies. Okay, somebody else. Read the poem for us. Grace.
His gaze has from the passing of the bars grown so tired that it holds nothing more. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars no world. The supple pace of powerful, soft strides, turning in the very smallest circle, is like a dance of strength around a center in which a great will stands, numbed. Only sometimes the curtain of the pupil soundlessly slides up, then an image enters, glides through the limbs' taut stillness, dives into the heart, and dies.
Thank you. So what are we looking at here? What's happening in this poem?
I think he's looking at a panther in behind bars in a cage of some kind, maybe in a zoo. And he's looking at this powerful being, this powerful will, because the panther is a creature that is very wild and is very fierce. But now it's been numbed, in a sense, because it's behind bars and its will is broken. It's feeling that it's been defeated. So,
Have you guys seen that? That's actually absolutely the case. I know that you're all in this era of zoos that aren't really zoos. I mean, animals get like wide habitats that are like their natural habitats, which is wonderful. This period that Rilke was writing in was in the early 1900s in Paris. He had gone there to reform his writing life. He was a lazy writer. He waited to be inspired, and that didn't happen too often. And so he decided he was going to go to Paris. He was going to write every day. He had his notebook, and he would just go through the city streets and make records of things. And one of the things that he encountered was a zoo in the center of Paris. And of course, in the 1900s, they had small cages for big cats. And so, have you guys seen this, the way a cat will pace and pace and pace in a small space? Where did you see that, Seth?
Let's see. When we lived in Minnesota, we had a cat, and she was becoming pregnant, and we had to put her in a cage, and she would just walk around and around that cage.
So it was this big.
A little bit bigger, but yes, essentially. It was pretty small. We'd put stuff in it to keep her comfortable, but she didn't really like being in it, but we had to keep her in it just for, safety's sake and all that.
That's wonderful, because it's sort of the mini version of this. Multiply that by 100,000, and you've got this enormous, beautiful creature meant to run and pounce. And what is it doing? It's going around and around and around. So that's the image. Anything else you want to add to that observation of the basic picture that we're looking at? and how that picture is sort of painted for us, how it's made into an experience so that we're experiencing it in the poem, not just being told about it?
She compares parts of the Panther strides to things that we're already familiar with, like when it says the curtain of the pupils, so that she's referring to the eyelids, and describing that big wait it took to, usually they just flash open, but because he's so tired, the curtain slowly opening. And then she goes soundlessly slide, so you can, then that S sound, it's almost like onomatopoeia, I guess.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. So the kind of dullness of this powerful but impotent cat is even being expressed in the description of the eyelids and the sounds that are being used. Yeah, that's a great observation. What else?
At times when poems reiterate something, just drive the point home. If it's not the best writer, it gets monotonous and boring. But here it just hits the point home so that it's really real and alive. Just, how you have the curtain slides up, and it's so familiar to us and yet foreign that it really hits home and is totally new. Even if you thought about it, she says it in a new way.
Yes, by the way, I have to say that Rainer Maria Rilke is a man. Sorry.
Says it.
But absolutely, Ellen, that is such a great observation. Let's look at stanza 1. Bars, bars, bars. Okay, 4 lines, bars repeated 3 times. You could say that poetry is all about meaningful repetition. And like you say, repetition, if you're not a good poet, can get pretty dull. But in this case, repetition is being used for emphasis, so that we feel that we're in a cage in that stanza, right? We are surrounded by bars as a reader, just as the cat is surrounded by bars. We can't get away from it. That's a wonderful observation. What else? What about the fact that we're talking about a cat here in stanza 1? How do you know that there's some empathy on the part of the observer or the speaker towards this cat? What tips you off?
She uses the word so tired. You naturally want to sympathize with that kind of vulnerability.
Yes, absolutely. And even before that, his gaze. Do you often call animals with those kind of pronouns? Often you'll say it, right, when you're referring to an animal, but right from word 1 in the poem, there's this kind of sympathetic association with the scene, with what we're looking at. That's our clue that while this is an image, this is also more than an image. This is a symbol. And we're not just talking about a cat. We're talking about more than a cat. But let's stay on the cat for a minute. How about stanza number 2? First of all, anything you want to observe about punctuation in stanza number 1?
This poem is translated.
It is.
So the original punctuation is different.
Yes. But let's just say, I mean, you're absolutely right that with translation, every poem becomes a new poem. There are 2 artists at work. However, let's just look at it from the English, not knowing the German, and say, what do you observe about, the ending of the lines and the kind of punctuation that's being used? Anything? I think it's not.
The sentences seem to be long and almost flowing.
Okay.
If you think of it that way, which makes it smooth, which then you see it using a sort of quietness and smoothness throughout the poem to empathize with the great will that has been brought down and now is not doing anything really. And so that smoothness through the sentences also creates also associates itself with the way that the words create empathy. So I think just the way the sentences flow into one another also creates a little bit of empathy or association.
Yes, I mean, we get that sense of the cat moving, right? The flow, and then also the cat being stopped because of the bars. So you're right. There's 2 sentences in the first stanza. They're each flowing sentences, but they're each brought up abruptly. We feel the bars and we end on periods halfway through the stanza and then again at the end of the stanza. Notice too that what a poet chooses to end the stanza on is also significant. We have bars for the end of line 1 and line 3. We have bars in line 4 and then no world. Okay, so we are left with the world being uncreated because of this barrier, because of this confinement. And that's where the poet leaves us, because there's now white space, and whenever there's white space in a poem, it's a pause, and so we're kind of stuck there with the panther. So we're taking on the experience. I mean, this is what literature is about, right? You experience what someone else has experienced because of their technical and imaginative skill. Second stanza. What's happening there? This is different. In terms of punctuation, we don't have a period until the end. What's happening in this stanza, and why does the punctuation aid the content?
Well, the turning, if you think of a circle, it's really unending. And so if we're not ending, if there's no period, the ending until the next, until the white space,
Right.
that gives us a sort of feeling of the supple pace of the powerful soft strides. You can feel like a big cat. You notice its strides, especially the panther and the leopard, are very long due to the long, thin body. And so you can feel that long stride, but confined into a circle.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Do you want to add to that, Grace?
I was
Or are you going to say the same thing?
Also, it's also neat how you're talking about that feeling of the stride. And I think it's interesting. He kind of uses like alliteration, chiasmic alliteration to do it when he says the supple pace of the powerful soft stride. So he adds an extra S on the end, but it's SPPS. S.
So we almost hear the pads of
Yeah.
the feet
Going,
alongside
yeah.
the big sort of strength of the cat itself, the dance of strength. Absolutely, these are wonderful observations. This is a stanza in which there's a kind of unleashing. We get just a taste of that power. Of course, it's not the full dose because we're not in the wild, but we get more than we did in the first stanza. And this brings us a sense of awe, right? And that sense of awe is finished with what line? Where are we left hanging at the end of the second stanza? Numbed. So, no world, numbed. And numbed comes after this build-up, this crescendo of power. So it's we've tasted of something, and then, again, we're pulled short, we're pulled back. How about the last stanza? Little hope, maybe, in this stanza? Little sunlight shining through?
Well, it says died at the end.
It does.
So again, there's that crescendo of there's that sort of chance, but then we're left dead with
Yes.
more.
It's interesting when it talks about the curtain of pupils moving and something slidlessly sounding. I think it seems like he's talking about more than the panther in this case.
Let's go into that.
Because, I think there's an image that's striking the panther, as if something is catching his eye, as if something maybe from his old life, or something realer than what he's experiencing in the cage is coming through to him. But then that dies, and he goes back to the old sense, and it's almost as if the curtain of pupils is the curtain that is blocking his sight.
The eyes are the window of the soul.
The window of the soul. So I think must be that Rilke this is part of what his experience is, that he can empathize with the panther, and that one moment of enlightenment, or that maybe the poetic moment of inspiration even, and it's sliding into the soul, but then it's dying.
So emotionally. Well, Grace, what were you going to say?
This is just an observation, but it says 1875 to 1926, so that would have been like after slavery, and
Except we're in Europe.
so it would have been a long time after slavery. But I don't know. It seems like maybe he's talking about how, as people, we're word blinded, and we travel around in our own cages that we make for ourselves, like the way our nation made slavery for ourselves. And every once in a great while, we'll have one great thinker who opens the lids, but then he dies, and we're back to where we started.
I'm so glad that you're all taking it in this direction, because of course Rilke himself was likely not referring to slavery. However, what he does in this poem is he creates an image which is symbolic, which is so powerful that as readers, we enter into his imagination and we fill in some of those blanks. We may think about slavery in the United States. We may think about our own personal, spiritual, or emotional cages, maybe something that we're so afraid of that we cannot overcome, or something that that has been imposed on us by society, not necessarily slavery, but some other. Can you think of cages that culture can put people in? Boxes or confinement that...
like any kind of stereotype.
Okay.
In World War II with the Jews,
Uh-huh.
they said, all Jews are bad.
Right. That was an imprisonment, both psychological and literal, that was like a cage. And so this is the beauty of poetry. There's a very sort of specific reference here that's direct, that's concrete, but it's also suggestive of meaning beyond itself. So the images are suggesting something more. And as readers, we are in this dance with the poet, and the poet is allowing us a freedom of movement, in this poem in particular, to kind of fill in the blank for ourselves. What are the cages that we live in? What are the cages that we put other people in? What are the historic cages that we're conscious of, that we're aware of? And that's the mark of a good poem, that it was, maybe Rilke wrote it about himself in his own writing experience, we don't know, but it was so well done and it was so suggestive, and there was enough room for it to be not just personal and occasional, but universal. It welcomes us into itself.
Another thing that this thing experiences that ties into what we've been talking about is the experience of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're brought back to reality, that hope is non-existent.
It's bitter.
That there's no way. Actually, I was reading, I don't remember who it was by, but I was reading a really good book on my Kindle full of these short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it was back in the times of where the Jews were really hated by the English, because they bought up all the property and it turned into a financial nightmare for the English. And so they had been torturing this Jew cleric for some reason, and they let him, the night before he was supposed to be killed, he found his door open. The guy had locked it before he shut it. And so he nearly escaped, and when he went out in the courtyard, they had been waiting for him, and they're like, the greatest torture is hope. Mm-hmm. And you can almost relate it back to the writer as his hope to become a better writer, or not as lazy as you put it. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of ways, and with today's culture, hope isn't very explored idea anymore, or not very mentioned, not very common. You have to be grounded in reality, such as like a new religion. If Christianity was introduced today, it'd be much different. It would be less accepted, probably.
I love that line. Hope is the greatest torture. I really think that that's a very wonderful summary of this poem. And I think that both in terms of the language and its movement, in terms of the punctuation and the stanzas, as well as the images, we are being given hope like the panther and then pulled back from that precipice of of change, the possibility of something different, and we're pulled back. And he is giving, T.S. Eliot also says that, April is the cruelest month for the same reason, because, we're constantly hopeful that finally spring is going to return and rescue us from the winter, and it keeps being deferred. And we have that experience in this poem. Let's move on. That was a wonderful discussion, and I love so many of the things that you guys saw in that poem. We're going to do one more poem that is related to images, and I think that this time we'll do just a very simple poem and we'll memorize it together. This is fun. You might feel like I'm humoring you or treating you like children, but I do this with all of my students. I do it with college students. I make them do hand motions to memorize the poem because it makes it so much easier. So we're going to do Dust of Snow by Robert Frost. And this is partly just to show that, sometimes images are just, you can take them at face value. You don't always read in and find symbols and a lot of depth of meaning. Sometimes poems are just fun and recording a simple moment that you experienced in the day. And this is certainly the case with this poem. So I'll read it aloud, and then we'll do hand motions. Actually, why doesn't someone else read it aloud? You guys are probably familiar with this poem. And then we'll do hand motions and memorize it. Somebody?
The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and saved a part of a day I rued.
Okay. Any vocabulary words that we need to define there? Nabokov said the best reader is someone with a good imagination and a dictionary. In other words, really a lot of the hard work that we do in literature is just looking up words that we're not familiar with.
Well, a really hard word that is actually really old would be rude.
Okay.
Sort of regret.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So let's start, okay? Here's our crow. And I'll do the line, and then you guys can do it after me, okay? The way a crow. All right, your turn. The way a crow shook down on me. Shook down on me. The dust of snow. The dust of snow. From a hemlock tree.
From a hemlock tree.
Okay, now let's do stanza one. Normally I would stop and do each line and go back and do it with the second line, but this is a quick and easy one. But let's do the whole first stanza, okay? The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart, a change of mood, and saved a part of a day I rued. Okay, second stanza. Has given my heart a change of mood and saved a part of a day I rued. Okay, from the top, and we'll do the title. It's easy to miss the title when you're reading poems, but that is the first line of the poem, so we need to do it. The poet is giving us a great insight about the poem. It's a head start, an encapsulation. So, Dust of Snow. The way I messed it up. Let's start again. Okay. The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and saved a part of a day I rued. Okay, so what are we looking at here? And not only looking at, but touching, feeling.
He's describing a quick little experience that he remembers and wants to remember for a long time, so he puts it in a poem. And
Nice.
I think the way he wrote it does a good encapsulation of that because it's short, and the rhyme scheme is really like cheery and kind of motify. The same way you want to remember this poem is like a little cute little moment.
Yeah, so the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B. So we hear the sound really close together. And it's very, it's not an off rhyme or a slant rhyme like Emily Dickinson does a lot. It's a full rhyme, right? So it really, the whole thing rhymes with its counterpart. That's great. I love the way you say he just wanted to save this moment. The other thing that I would like to point out, according to that definition that I read you about images, is from, remember Jay Perrin said that it's a complex emotional unit. So that at the same time that you're seeing it, you're feeling something with it. And that's what happens here, right? There's this cheer that comes with the spray of snow from a crow. Any other observations?
I think you could almost think of it as a morsel.
Ah,
Or a
nice
snapshot.
word choice.
You think of a morsel as a small bit of choice food, is the way I would describe
What are your
it.
favorite morsels, Seth?
Oh boy. Oh gosh. I like a small bit of rare beef once in a while, just like a little
Nice
piece of
choice.
it.
Yes.
With a little bit of seasoning. So I think you can think of it as
Yeah.
almost, if you take the meat, it's kind of juicy and it's something to be enjoyed.
Yes. And not really pondered over for too long, not labored over, not like a meal with a fillet and, but just a little piece of beef on a toothpick. Yeah, that's a really nice analogy. Frost, of course, was a great outdoorsman, so many of his poems are set in the woods. He loved the woods, he walked in the woods. And even though we may not be that person, we live in towns and suburbia and maybe even cities, we understand what it is to have the course of our emotional flow in a given day or moment just suddenly changed by something that intervenes, right? So it does include us in itself. Has that ever happened to you, Noah? Like some little thing kind of pierces your mood or your day and lifts you up. It's changed after that.
Yeah, it's happened to me before.
Yeah. And I think that Grace's comment that it's sort of sing-song and uplifting from the beginning gives us a sense of what to expect in terms of the change of mood. Did you want to say something else, Grace?
Sorry. This is just an observation, but there's this parallel. The same way, like, you might not appreciate a bird dumping snow on your face. He took that and turned it into something happy, like giving my heart a change of mood. That is parallel with the way he had a bad day and it was a good day because of it. And so it's like a poem's all about analogy and describing things with other things. So he's describing his experience with the poem itself as he uses the poem.
Very nice. So there's a kind of double,
Yeah.
and a revisiting of it through the poem, through the vehicle of the poem. That's great. Okay, any other comments about imagery and its relationship to our emotional lives, to its ability to contain time, stop time for a little bit?
Well, stop time. I think you can, again, if a good poet with a good poem, you can see a bit of the person who wrote it, a bit of their character, even if it's something as short as this. I think you can see that either he really likes winter, or that he's willing to let small things that can be annoyances perhaps, use them the opposite way and make them joyful experiences, and just to kind of step back and look at life and, just snow and enjoy it. Even if everyone might not enjoy it, you can learn to do that.
I love that concept that you're articulating. In fact, it makes me think of something that Frost said in another poem, Directive, where he is talking about children, and he says, "Weep for the little things that made them glad." And in this sense, in this poem, we sense that he's letting himself be childlike and be impacted by a little thing, by a detail, as you say, and gladdened by it. So again, I mean, if we were going to maybe overinterpret this poem, what direction would we take the conversation? We would try to make it symbolic in ways that it probably is not. How would we do that? What might be a gross overreading or reading into of this poem?
This poem is an analogy for the change of heart in the feminist movement in America. And
Okay.
Robert Frost is supporting the, whatever.
Right, so we might link it to some social, political event that really is on our minds, but clearly not on Robert Frost's mind right now. Good, that's one way that we overinterpret. Any other ways?
The influence of the African American, the Crow, African American population, the Civil War, the influence of the Civil War is having on Crow's life. Is saving a part of his life.
Okay, yes. So again, we give it a context that the poem has not earned. For us, the crow, we associate it with something else, or history has maybe associated it with something else, but Frost hasn't done that for us. And so there are times when, as in the Panther, you can say, well, my experience fits into this image. And then there are times when it really doesn't fit into the image, and you're being a bad reader of poetry. You might also say something like, snow is a symbol of purity, and Frost, when he was, the speaker in this poem, we don't assume that the poet is the speaker, but the speaker in this poem obviously had a guilty conscience and was out walking on a snowy day, and because the snow fell on him, it was a sort of purification rite. It was clean and white, and he was made clean and white and new by virtue of the symbolic snow falling on him, right? And then you might try to associate that with Christianity and Christ's sacrifice that made people clean. So you see, you get the picture, right? People do this when they read literature. They think, oh, literature is supposed to be symbolic, and so let's go find those symbols. And one thing that's really important, which you guys have all learned, obviously, is to let the poem make suggestions and let the poem lead you into an interpretation that you can support. And if you can't support the interpretation, then maybe it's not a valid interpretation. Okay, that is, for now, the end of chapter 1. There are a bunch of activities at the back of the book, and they're really fun activities. We did one of them, which was to introduce ourselves with an image. But there are others that involve free writing and making pictures and writing a poem. And I would encourage you all to choose one and come back with your product next time. Okay, so don't miss those prompts at the back, especially if you're interested in developing a writing portfolio or a poem of your own, a poetry portfolio of your own. There are often suggestions for writing poems at the end of the chapter. All right, that's all for today. We're on our image chapter, the activities at the end of the chapter, and I'm going to do a few of these activities to give you a sense of how I would complete them myself. So activity number 1 says take 5 minutes and free write about images from one of the 4 seasons. In free writing, you write for the entire time, not planning what you say, but simply writing anything that comes to your mind. Even when nothing comes to your mind, it helps to generate ideas. So the purpose of this exercise, and you have probably used this in just independently, it's an instinctive thing to do, that the basis behind it is this idea that we write in order to figure out what we think about things. We also write in order to generate ideas about things. And so it's almost like like stretching or something would be for an athlete. You kind of limber up, loosen up, get things moving so that when you actually do the race, you don't pull a muscle. And similarly, this helps to loosen the thoughts of the brain. And so it's very good for composition, but it's also good for writing poems. You'll stumble upon things. And one of the reasons that you keep a small time limit is that sort of forces you to engage. Whereas if you give yourself a half an hour, you might, dream about what you're having for dinner or something. But when you have 4 or 5 minutes, you concentrate and you give it a burst of intense focus. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to choose a season and begin writing about it, and just show you how simple this is. So I will read you what I say here and then just kind of give you a short response to it. I say, it's fall, green still with mist rising from the damp ground. It smells like dark earth, humus, the kind with dead things in it that smells richly of life. Keats thought of this as a cusp moment, a fullness, ripeness on the edge of death and dying. The leaves, despite heavy rains, are turning flame, bursting into flame, orange, red, still veined with green, like the burning bush, speaking to us of holiness, change, our own death, which Whitman said was different than anyone supposed and luckier. Eddie died, and her memorial was 2 weeks ago. All this is present in the dark earth of my autumn. And I'll just tell you that I didn't plan what I was going to say. I didn't think about it, and that's part of the point of this. It's meant to kind of pull out of you what you might be thinking of or what might be with you unconsciously. And you should let yourself wander as far as you want to go. Don't say, oh no, I'm talking about, Earth. That's not strictly about a season. This is meant to be associative, where one thing leads you on to the next thing. It's meant to be wandering. So let yourself wander, and the main thing is when you get stuck, you just keep writing. So even if you don't have anything to say, you can write, I don't have anything to say. I remember the last time I didn't have anything to say. Or you can just look out your window and describe something. But it's a great exercise, and if you are an aspiring poet, or if you seek simply to understand some of the sources that poetry comes from, it wouldn't hurt for you to spend, the first 5 minutes of your day, or the last 5 minutes of your day, or of your lunch hour doing this and just making a notebook, collecting some of these reflections. The next activity that I'm going to do is to describe an image that is important to me. This is number 2. Discuss and identify an image that's important to your class. What kind of images did you choose? Could they be called symbols? Why or why not? If they are symbols, what multiple meanings do your images represent? Now you remember, because we just did the image chapter, that images are any sort of sensory detail. And metaphors and symbols you haven't studied yet, but what you'll find very quickly when you do study them is that they use images to create a figure of speech. And in the case of metaphor, the figure of speech is a direct comparison, A equals B. And in the case of symbol, the comparison is indirect. So the terminology might be A equals X, where X has multiple suggestions. And I think this is sort of technical language that's just describing something that happens to you all the time. So I'll describe an image for me and tell you how it happens with me. You'll know also that I like to have my classes introduce themselves with their names and an image that is important to them. And this is why you really get to know people well when you enter their own minds and their own sort of collection of images that they collect. So the image that I'm going to choose is the image of homemade baked bread. And I love the smell of baking bread. I love the taste of it, of course. I like the graininess, the fact that it's got imperfections and bumps, and you can make it into different shapes when you make it at home. I remember as a kid coming home from school, which school was sort of being out there in the world and not being confident about the people who are around you necessarily, having a sense of, being on your own and fending for yourself and, the big bad world kind of idea. I know that's not everybody's experience of school, but that was mine. And I remember coming home from school and being greeted at the front door with the smell of bread. Sometimes I could smell it even before I got in the house. I would get off the bus and walk home. And that smell became for me symbolic of the greeting of home, the comfort of home, the welcome of being in an environment that was nurturing, where you knew you were a part of things. You knew you were going to be loved and accepted, no matter how you performed. And it was also significant to me that my mother made the bread, because she was, of course, very nurturing. Not of course, I guess not every mother is nurturing, but she was very nurturing, and she was the probably the epitome of the person in my life who gave me what I needed to be sustained in a physical way, in particular, by feeding me and clothing me and getting me out the door and waking me up and that kind of thing. But it also made me think of her for other reasons, because she had grown up in India. And in India, they saw a lot of people suffering and starving. And so she was very thrifty, and ever after in our childhoods, really used resources well. She was green before the rest of the world was green. So she liked making things naturally from scratch and conserving resources and being healthy. And sometimes I even had recycled bread bags for my lunch, and that embarrassed me, of course. But so in any case, as you can see, this image of the smell and taste and feel and look of bread has, for me, become a symbol. And it's not just a single abstract idea, bread equals love, but it has multiple suggestions, and that's what a symbol is, and that's what you can do with an image. I suggest that you be wonderful for you to do this with a partner, or to do this with a class, and even to figure out what your image is, to do some free writing and kind of figure out all the suggestions and connotations of a particular image in your experience.